They said he stole children, and by sunrise the whole town believed it. Before we go on, tell me, where are you watching from? And do you believe a man can be judged without knowing his story? Because out here, judgment rides faster than truth. And that morning the dust along Red Hollow Road hung low and heavy like it didn't want to rise, like it knew something was about to change. Elias Carter stood alone beside a weathered fence, hat low, coat worn thin at the elbows, a man the town had long since decided was better left alone, and maybe that was fine by him, because silence had been his only companion for years, the kind that settles deep in your bones and stays there. Then came the sound, soft at first, like boots dragging through dry dirt, and when he turned, he saw them. 3 children, no older than 10, clothes torn, faces streaked with dust, and something older than fear, something like waiting too long for help that never came. They didn't speak, not at first, just stood there at the edge of his land as if crossing that invisible line might cost them something they didn't have left. Elias didn't move either, just watched, measuring the distance, the risk, the quiet weight of what it meant to step forward. In this land, a man didn't take in strays without consequence. And these weren't just any children. One of them, a girl with dark hair tangled by wind and time, wore a small leather cord around her neck, Apache markings carved into it, faint but unmistakable. The town would see that and draw their own conclusions. They always did. The boy beside her shifted his weight, like he might run, but didn't, and that told Elias more than words ever could, because children who still believed in running hadn't yet learned what it meant to have nowhere to go. The wind moved through the dry grass, carrying the scent of horses and sunburnt wood, and somewhere far off, a door slammed, sharp and final. Elias stepped forward, slow, careful, like approaching a wounded animal, and when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, not asking, not commanding, just offering something the world rarely did. You hungry? The smallest one nodded before the others could stop him, and that was enough. He turned, walked back toward his cabin without checking if they'd follow, because some choices don't need witnesses, they just need a man willing to make them. Behind him, the soft crunch of footsteps answered. Inside, the cabin smelled of old leather, coffee gone cold, and the faint trace of smoke from nights spent alone. He set bread on the table, poured water into tin cups, watched as hesitation gave way to need, small hands reaching, tearing, eating like they'd learned not to trust tomorrow. The girl didn't sit right away, her eyes scanning the room, the corners, the door, always the door, and when she finally stepped in, she kept that leather cord tight in her grip, like it held more than memory, like it held a promise. Elias noticed but said nothing, because some stories aren't his to ask for. Outside, the sun climbed higher, casting long lines of light through the cracks in the wood, and with it came the sound of hooves, distant but growing, the kind of sound that carries questions before it carries men. Elias paused, just for a second, and in that second he saw it all. The whispers, the looks, the way this would turn, because a lone cowboy taking in abandoned children didn't look like kindness to a town that had forgotten what kindness cost. The boy looked up at him, crumbs on his lips, eyes unsure, but hopeful in a way that felt dangerous, and Elias realized something then, something quiet and heavy, that the moment he let them cross that threshold, his life had already changed direction, no turning back, no easy road forward. He stepped to the door, pushed it open just enough to let the light spill in, and out there, beyond the fence, dust began to rise in a thin line, riders coming, not fast, but certain, and behind him, inside that small, worn cabin, 3 children waited, not for answers, not for promises, just to see if this man would stand when the world came knocking. And Elias Carter, who had spent years avoiding trouble, finally understood that sometimes trouble isn't something you ride into. Sometimes it walks right up to your door, quiet, hungry, and asking nothing more than a chance to stay. The riders did not rush, and that was what made them dangerous, because men who rode slow already believed the outcome was decided before they arrived. The dust lifted behind them in a thin, steady line. 6 horses, maybe 7, hard to tell through the heat shimmer, but Elias Carter did not need a number to understand what was coming. He had seen that kind of approach before, the kind that carried questions shaped like accusations. Inside the cabin, The children had gone quiet. The sound of chewing faded into stillness, even the smallest one holding his breath like the air itself might betray them. And the girl, Ayana, moved closer to the wall, not hiding, just placing herself where she could see both the door and the window at once, her fingers still wrapped around that leather cord as if it anchored her to something stronger than fear. Elias stepped fully outside now, letting the door rest open behind him, not closing it, not sealing them in. Because whatever came next needed to see him first, not them. The sun sat high above, pressing heat into the ground, turning every shadow sharp and honest, and when the riders finally slowed near his fence, their horses snorted softly, restless but controlled, like they had been trained to wait for a signal that had not yet been given. The man in front tipped his hat just enough to show his eyes, pale and certain, the kind of eyes that measured land, livestock, and men the same way, as if everything had a value that could be claimed or taken. He looked past Elias, just for a second, toward the open door, and that was enough to tell him everything he thought he needed to know. "You have company," he said, his voice calm, almost polite, but the words carried weight, the kind that settled without asking permission. Elias did not answer right away. He let the silence stretch, let the wind move between them, because out here, the first man to fill the silence usually gave away more than he intended. Finally, he spoke, simple, steady. They needed food. One of the riders shifted in his saddle, a quiet scoff under his breath, and another leaned slightly forward, eyes narrowing, not in anger, but in something colder, something like certainty being confirmed. The man in front nodded once, slow, as if Elias had just admitted to something larger than he understood, and maybe in their minds, he had. "You know what people are saying in town," the man continued, not asking, just placing the words between them like markers in the dirt. Elias glanced once toward the horizon, toward the direction of that town he rarely visited, a place where doors closed a little quicker when he walked by, where conversations softened but never stopped. He knew what they were saying, he just did not care enough to repeat it. "People say a lot of things," he replied, his voice even, carrying no defense, no apology. The man studied him for a moment longer, then shifted his gaze again toward the cabin, and this time he did not bother to hide it. "Those are not your kind of children." The words hung there, dry as the air, and behind Elias, a faint movement inside, a chair leg brushing wood. Quick and quiet, but not quiet enough. Elias took a single step to the side, just enough to block the doorway without making it obvious, just enough to remind them where the line was drawn. "They are on my land," he said, and that was all. The riders exchanged looks, small, almost invisible, but Elias saw it, the agreement forming without words, the kind that spread faster than fire once it found dry ground. The man in front sighed softly, not out of frustration, but out of something like patience running thin. "This land sits close to town, Carter, closer than you seem to remember, and what happens here tends to matter out there." Elias let that settle, let it pass through him without taking hold, because he had spent years learning how not to carry things that were never his to begin with. "Then they should come talk to me themselves," he said, and there was no challenge in it, just a statement, flat and unmoving. The wind shifted then, carrying the faint smell of dust and something else, something like change that had not yet decided what shape it would take. The man's expression did not harden, it did not soften either, it simply closed, like a door being shut somewhere deep behind his eyes. "We are talking to you," he said quietly, and for a moment, no one moved, not the riders, not Elias, not even the horses. Then, slowly, the man turned his horse, not in retreat, but in conclusion, the kind that promised something unfinished. The others followed, one by one, the line of dust forming again as they rode back the way they came, leaving the air heavier than before. Elias stood there until they were nothing but shapes against the horizon, then nothing at all. Only then did he turn back toward the cabin, where the silence inside had changed, not broken, just shifted, like something fragile learning how to hold its breath a little longer. When he stepped in, the children looked at him, not with questions, not yet, but with something deeper, something like waiting to see if the ground beneath them was still there. Elias closed the door this time, slow, deliberate, the wood settling into place with a soft final sound, and for the first time in years, the quiet inside that cabin did not feel empty. It felt like the beginning of something that would not stay small for long. The night came slow, stretching shadows across the dry ground until the world outside the cabin turned the color of ash and memory, and inside, the quiet held tighter than before, not empty, not peaceful, but waiting. Elias Carter sat near the small table, hands resting flat against the worn wood, listening to the soft sounds behind him, the careful shifting of feet, the rustle of cloth, the kind of movement that belonged to people who had learned not to take up more space than they were given. The smallest boy had fallen asleep with his head against the wall, breathing shallow but steady, while the other two stayed awake, watching, always watching, as if sleep itself was a risk they could not afford. Ayanna stood near the window, her eyes tracing the last light slipping away beyond the horizon, her fingers still wrapped around that leather cord, but now she held it differently, not just tight, but deliberate, like she was remembering something, or deciding something. Elias noticed that, the way she shifted her weight, the way her shoulders carried more than her age should allow, and he understood something then without needing words. This girl was not just following, she was choosing. The wind outside brushed against the cabin walls, low and constant, carrying the dry scent of open land, and somewhere far off, a coyote called once, then fell silent, as if even the wild knew to keep its distance tonight. Elias stood slowly, crossing the room with measured steps, and without speaking, he placed another piece of bread on the table, closer to where Ayanna stood, not offering it directly, not forcing the moment, just placing it there as something that could be taken or left. She looked at it, then at him, her eyes sharp, searching, not for kindness, but for truth, and after a long second, she stepped forward and took it, small, controlled, like accepting help did not mean surrender. "They will come back," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of certainty, not fear, and Elias nodded once, because he knew that too. "Most things do," he replied, his tone even, as if they were talking about weather, not people. The older boy shifted then, finally speaking for the first time, his voice rough, unsure. "They will tell the others." And there it was, the thing hanging between all of them. Not what had happened, but what would spread from it. Elias leaned slightly against the wall, crossing his arms, not defensive, just steady. "Let them," he said, and the words landed softer than expected, not careless, not brave, just decided. Ayanna studied him again, longer this time, like she was trying to understand the shape of a man who did not move the way the world expected him to, and something in her gaze changed, just slightly, not trust, not yet, but recognition, like she had seen this kind of quiet strength before, maybe in stories, maybe in someone long gone. Outside, the night deepened, stars breaking through the dark one by one, cold and distant, and with them came the sense that this place, this small piece of land, had shifted without anyone noticing except those inside it. Elias moved to the door, opening it just enough to look out, not because he expected someone, but because a man like him never stopped checking the horizon, and the air that slipped and carried a stillness that felt heavier than silence, the kind that follows a decision that cannot be undone. Behind him, the children had settled, closer together now, not touching, but near enough that the space between them felt smaller, safer, and Ayanna had taken a seat at the edge of the table, the bread untouched in her hand, her eyes fixed on that small piece of wood Elias had set near the corner earlier without thinking, a scrap from something long ago, worn smooth by time. She reached for it slowly, turning it over in her fingers, tracing the faint lines carved into it. Simple marks, nothing special to anyone else. But her expression shifted again, deeper this time, as if she understood that even the smallest things could carry meaning if someone chose to give it. Elias watched that, quiet, saying nothing, but something inside him moved, something he had buried a long time ago, the idea that what you build does not always stay where you leave it. The wind pressed once more against the cabin, then eased, and for a moment, everything stilled, the kind of stillness that does not last, the kind that sits right before something begins to grow. Elias closed the door again, slower this time, his hand resting against the wood a second longer than needed. And when he turned back, the room felt different, Not because anything had changed, but because everything had. He looked at the three of them, really looked this time, not as strangers, not as trouble, but as something else entirely, something that had stepped into his life without asking and refused to leave quietly. And somewhere beyond the walls, beyond the land, beyond the reach of that small cabin, words were already moving from one mouth to another, shaping a story that would not belong to him anymore. But inside, in that quiet space, something else was taking root, something slower, stronger, and far harder to stop. And if you have made it this far, then you already feel it too. So tell me what you see in this moment, and leave a like if you understand why some choices change everything without ever raising their voice. Morning did not arrive with light. It arrived with sound. The low creak of wood cooling after a long night, the soft shift of boots against the floor, and the quiet understanding that whatever had begun the night before had not ended with sleep. Elias Carter was already awake, sitting outside on the narrow step of his cabin, hat tilted low as the first pale stretch of dawn broke across the horizon, painting the land in faded gold and long shadows that made everything look farther away than it was. He held a small knife in one hand and a piece of scrapwood in the other, carving slowly, deliberately, each cut measured, each line placed with a purpose only he understood, and the sound of blade against grain carried softly through the still air, steady as a heartbeat. Behind him, the door remained slightly open, not wide, not closed, just enough to let the inside and outside share the same breath. Ayanna stepped out first, quiet as the wind before it moves, her eyes adjusting to the light, her posture already alert, already aware. And she watched him for a moment before speaking, not interrupting, just waiting for the right space between motions. You knew they would come, she said, her voice low, carrying neither accusation nor surprise, just a statement shaped by experience. Elias did not stop carving, not right away. He let the blade finish its path before answering. People do not like what they do not understand, he said, and then, after a beat, and they understand even less when they are afraid. Ayanna stepped closer, her gaze dropping to the wood in his hands, noticing the marks now, the pattern, forming, simple lines crossing in a way that did not look like much unless you paid attention, unless you cared enough to see beyond the surface. What is it? She asked, and Elias turned the piece slightly, letting the morning light catch the edges of the carving. A marker, he said. Something that means you were here. She frowned slightly, not confused, but thinking. Why? She asked again, and this time Elias looked up at her, his eyes steady, older than the land itself seemed to be. Because the world forgets things that do not leave a mark, he said quietly. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of dust and something distant, something moving far beyond what the eye could see, and Ayanna followed that scent with her gaze, her body turning just slightly toward the horizon. They will not forget this, she said, and Elias nodded once, because that was the part he could not change. Behind them, the other children stirred, the older boy stepping out next, blinking against the light, his shoulders tense until he saw the open land, until he saw no riders waiting, no shadows closing in, and even then, he did not relax fully, just enough to breathe. Elias held out the small carved piece then, not toward Ayanna directly, but between them, a quiet offering without pressure, and after a moment, she took it, her fingers tracing the lines the same way she had traced the leather cord the night before, careful, deliberate, as if learning the shape of something that would matter later. Each line stands for a step, Elias said, his voice low, almost like he was speaking more to the air than to her. Not where you start, not where you end, just the steps you choose to take. Ayanna looked at it longer, then closed her hand around it, not hiding it, but holding it like something she intended to keep. The sun rose higher now, the light stronger, clearer, revealing the land in full, every dry patch, every worn path, every place where something had been and something had left, and in that light, the cabin looked smaller than it had the night before, more exposed, more real. Elias stood, slipping the knife back into his belt, his movements unhurried, and he looked out. Across the stretch of land that had been his for years, the fence lines, the open ground, the distance that once meant safety and now meant something else entirely. We will not stay long, he said, not as a warning, not as a plan, just as a truth that had settled into place. The boy looked at him sharply. "Where will we go?" he asked, and Elias did not answer right away, because that was not a question with a direction. It was a question with weight. Ayanna stepped in before he could, her voice quieter now, but firmer. "Anywhere they are not already looking," she said, and Elias glanced at her, a flicker of something passing through his expression, not surprise, not approval, something closer to recognition. The wind picked up slightly, brushing past them, lifting dust into small spirals that rose and vanished just as quickly. And in that movement, in that constant shifting of what could be seen and what could not, the choice settled fully into place. Elias turned back toward the cabin, stepping inside without hesitation, and when he came out again, he carried only what could be held without slowing a man down: a worn bag, a canteen, nothing more than what mattered. He paused at the doorway for a second, his hand resting against the frame, feeling the rough wood beneath his fingers, not as something he was leaving, but as something that had already done its part. Then he stepped forward, past the fence, into the open land, and after a brief hesitation, the children followed, one step, then another, until the distance between what they had been and what they were becoming began to stretch, thin at first, then stronger with every foot of ground they crossed, and behind them, the cabin stood quiet in the rising light, holding no answers, only the faint echo of something that had just begun. They walked without looking back, and that was the first lesson, because a man who keeps turning around never truly leaves. The ground stretched wide and dry beneath their feet, each step pressing into dust that carried no memory unless someone chose to leave one behind. And Elias Carter moved at a pace that did not rush, yet never slowed, the kind of pace that could carry a man 50 miles if needed without breaking him. The children followed, not in a line, not like a group being led, but like something learning how to move together without being told, the smallest boy staying close to the older one, while Ayanna walked slightly apart, not distant, just aware, her eyes scanning the land the way someone does when they know the land can answer before people do. The sun climbed higher, heat settling into their shoulders, into their backs, turning the air into something thick and honest, and after nearly 2 miles, Elias stopped near a narrow stretch of dry creek bed, its edges lined with brittle grass and smooth stones worn down by water that had not passed through in a long time. He crouched without a word, running his hand along the ground, feeling the texture, the direction of cracks, the faint traces left by things that had moved through before them, and after a moment, he nodded once, more to himself than to anyone else. "We rest here," he said quietly, and the children did not question it. They simply lowered themselves into the thin shade cast by the shallow bank, their movements still careful, still measuring how much space they were allowed to take. Ayanna remained standing a moment longer, watching him, then the ground, then the horizon, always the horizon, and finally she stepped down into the creek bed, her hand brushing lightly against the carved piece of wood Elias had given her, as if reminding herself it was still there. Elias removed his canteen, passing it first to the smallest boy, not out of habit, but out of choice, and the boy hesitated before taking it, glancing once at the others, then drinking in small, controlled sips, as if even water had to be earned. When it reached Ayanna, she drank last, not out of pride, but out of something else, something that had learned long ago to wait until the need was clear. The wind moved through the open land again, lifting strands of dry grass, carrying faint echoes from far-off places, and with it came a distant sound, barely there, but enough for Elias to tilt his head slightly, listening. Hooves, far away, not close enough to see, but close enough to matter. The older boy heard it next, his shoulders tightening, his eyes moving quickly, searching for direction, for instruction, but Elias did not rise, did not rush. He simply reached down, picking up a small stone, turning it once in his hand before placing it carefully at the edge of the creek bed. "They are not looking for where we are," he said calmly. "They are looking for where we were." The words settled slowly, not fully understood, but felt, and Ayanna stepped closer, her gaze following the direction of the sound, then shifting to the stone he had placed. "So we leave something else behind," she said quietly, and Elias glanced at her, a brief flicker of approval passing through his eyes. "Exactly," he replied. He stood then, moving along the creek bed, placing 2 more stones at uneven distances, not in a straight line, not in any pattern that would make sense unless someone knew what they were seeing. And when he returned, he nodded toward the children. "We move again," he said. They rose without hesitation this time, their steps quicker, more certain, and as they climbed out of the creek bed, the wind shifted once more, brushing over the stones, over the ground, softening edges, blending traces, until the path they had taken began to fade even before they were out of sight. The land ahead stretched wider, more open, the kind of space that made a person feel small if they let it, but Elias walked into it without hesitation, and one by one, the children followed, their shadows stretching long behind them, thin and uncertain at first, then stronger as the light grew steadier. After another mile, the smallest boy stumbled slightly, catching himself before falling, and Elias slowed. Just enough to let the distance close, not calling attention to it, not turning it into something it was not, just adjusting the pace so no one was left behind. Ayanna noticed that, the way he moved without making it visible, and something in her expression shifted again, not trust, not yet, but something closer to understanding, the kind that builds quietly, without asking permission. The sound of hooves faded behind them, whether because the riders had turned or because the distance had grown too great. None of them could tell, but the absence of it did not bring relief. It brought focus, because now the only sound left was their own movement, their own breath, their own steps marking a path that no longer belonged to where they started. The sun began its slow descent, shadows lengthening again, and in that changing light, Elias stopped once more, turning slightly, not to look back, but to measure what could no longer be seen. "From here on," he said, his voice low but clear, "we do not walk like we are being followed. We walk like we belong." The words hung in the air, simple, but carrying something deeper than direction, and Ayanna nodded once, her hand tightening briefly around the carved wood before relaxing again. They moved forward together then, not as strangers, not as something temporary, but as something that had begun to take shape, something that did not yet have a name, but already carried weight. And far behind them, where the land met the sky, the faintest trace of their passing disappeared into the dust, leaving nothing behind but the quiet understanding that whatever they were becoming could no longer be turned back by the time the sun dipped low enough to stretch their shadows thin across the land. The air had changed again, cooler now, carrying a quiet that did not feel empty but watchful, like the land itself had begun to notice them. Elias Carter slowed his steps near a ridge of broken rock rising no more than 10 feet from the ground, but high enough to offer something the open plains never did, a place where a man could see before being seen, and without a word, he climbed, his boots finding the worn edges with ease, years of moving through places like this shaping every step. The children followed more carefully, the older boy first, helping the smaller one, while Ayanna came last, not because she needed help, but because she was watching their path, committing it to memory, the way one learns to move through a world that does not always leave second chances. At the top, the view opened wide, miles of land stretching in every direction, dry grass bending under the slow push of evening wind, and far behind them, barely visible, a thin disturbance in the distance, not quite dust, not quite nothing, but enough to remind them that distance did not always mean safety. Elias crouched near the edge, resting one hand against the stone, his eyes narrowing slightly as he measured the horizon, not searching for shapes, but for patterns, for the way the land moved when something passed through it. "They are still out there," the older boy said quietly, his voice carrying both worry and certainty, and Elias did not deny it, because denying something did not make it less true. "Maybe," he replied, "but they are not where we are going." Ayanna stepped forward then, her gaze following the direction Elias had been watching her, hand brushing once more against the carved piece of wood, now worn slightly smoother from being held, and she spoke without looking at him. "You do not move like someone running," she said, and Elias let out a small breath that might have been the beginning of a smile, though it never fully formed. "That is because I am not," he answered, and then, after a moment, "Running teaches people to chase, but building makes them stop and wonder." The word hung there, building, heavier than it should have been, and Ayana turned to him. Really turned this time. Her expression sharper, more focused. "You are not just taking us somewhere," she said. And it was not a question. Elias met her gaze, steady, unhurried. "No," he said. "I am taking you somewhere that can become something." The wind moved stronger across the ridge now, carrying the faint scent of water, distant but real, and Elias stood, adjusting the strap of the worn bag over his shoulder. "We will reach it by tomorrow," he said, and without waiting, he began the descent on the far side of the ridge, away from the path they had taken, away from anything that still pointed backward. The children followed again, but this time their steps felt different, less uncertain, less like they were escaping and more like they were heading towards something they could not yet see but had begun to believe in. As they walked, the land shifted subtly, the ground dipping lower, the soil changing from brittle dust to something slightly darker, more compact, and after nearly another mile, the faint outline of a narrow stream appeared ahead, not wide, no more than 6 feet across, but steady, its surface catching the last light of day like a quiet promise. The smallest boy moved toward it instinctively, stopping just short of the edge, looking back as if asking permission without words, and Elias nodded once. Simple, and that was enough. The boy knelt, touching the water, his reflection breaking with the movement, and, for the first time since they had left the cabin, a small sound escaped him, not fear, not caution, something lighter, something closer to relief. Ayana approached more slowly, crouching beside the stream, her fingers brushing the surface, then lifting, watching the droplets fall back, her eyes thoughtful, measuring not just the water, but what it meant. "This place," she said quietly, "it can hold more than just us." Elias stood a few feet behind her, his gaze moving across the surrounding land, the low rise of ground to the west, the line of trees further beyond, sparse but strong, and he nodded once, as if confirming something he had already decided long before they arrived. "That is the idea," he said. The sun slipped below the horizon then, the sky shifting into deeper shades of blue and gold, and with it came a calm that felt earned, not given, the kind that follows movement with purpose. Elias set down his bag near the stream, kneeling to gather a few small branches, arranging them without rush, without ceremony, just enough to mark a place, just enough to begin. The children watched, not speaking, not interrupting, and Ayana remained still a moment longer before standing. Stepping back from the water, her hand tightening briefly around the carved wood before she slipped it into a fold of her clothing, not hiding it, but keeping it close. She looked out across the land again, then back at Elias, and in that glance, something passed between them, quiet, unspoken, but understood. This was no longer about where they had come from. It was about what would stand here when they were gone. The wind softened, the night settling gently around them, and for the first time, the space they stood in did not feel temporary. It felt like the beginning of something that could last. And if you have stayed with this story until now, then you are part of that beginning too. And I want to thank you for listening this far, because some journeys only matter when someone chooses to witness them. The fire did not start with flame. It started with hands, small ones gathering dry twigs, older ones stacking branches the way Elias had shown them, careful, spaced, leaving room for air, because even something as simple as warmth needed space to breathe. The stream moved quietly beside them, no more than a soft whisper against stone, and above, the sky stretched wide and endless, stars beginning to settle in like distant witnesses to something they did not yet understand. Elias Carter worked without speaking, striking flint against steel until a spark caught, then another, until a thin thread of smoke rose, slow and deliberate. And when the flame finally took hold, it did not rush, it grew, steady, patient, like everything else he did. The children watched closely, not just the fire, but the way he moved around it, the way he placed each piece of wood with purpose, never wasting motion, never forcing anything that could be done with time. Instead, the smallest boy sat closest, his eyes reflecting the flicker of light, his shoulders no longer pulled tight, not fully relaxed, but closer than before, and when the warmth reached him, he leaned in just a little more, as if testing whether something gentle could last. Ayana remained just beyond the circle of light at first, her silhouette outlined against the dim glow, her gaze shifting between Elias, the fire, and the land beyond, always measuring, always weighing what could be trusted. After a while, she stepped forward, closing the distance, not because she had decided it was safe, but because she had decided it was worth the risk. Elias noticed, but he did not react, did not acknowledge it in a way that would turn it into something fragile. He simply continued, letting the moment belong to her. When the fire settled into a steady burn, he reached into his bag and pulled out another small piece of wood, similar to the one he had given her before, but not the same. This one still rough, unfinished, and he placed it on the ground between them without a word. The older boy glanced at it, then at Elias, uncertain, and Elias finally spoke, his voice low, carried by the quiet around them. "Tomorrow, we start marking this place," he said, and the words landed differently than anything before, not about movement, not about leaving, but about staying. The children exchanged brief looks, not speaking, but something passed between them, something like the first shape of belonging. Ayana crouched slowly, picking up the new piece of wood, turning it in her fingers, then looking at Elias. "You will make one. For each of us," she said. And again, it was not a question. Elias nodded once. "Each of you will make your own," he corrected gently, and the smallest boy looked up at that, confusion flickering across his face. "But we do not know how," he said, his voice quiet, almost apologetic. Elias met his gaze, steady, unshaken. "You will," he said, and there was no doubt in it, no room for hesitation, just a quiet certainty that settled deeper than reassurance. The wind shifted again, softer now, carrying the faint scent of water and earth, and for a moment, the world around them felt still, not empty, but full in a way that did not need to be filled with noise. Ayana lowered her gaze back to the wood in her hands, her fingers tracing its edges. Then, slowly, she reached toward the fire, picking up a small charred stick, testing its weight, and without looking up, she pressed its tip against the wood, drawing the first faint line. It was not straight, not perfect, but it was there, a mark where there had been none before, and Elias watched, saying nothing, because this was not something to guide, it was something to allow. The older boy followed after a moment, picking up another piece, hesitating only briefly before making his own mark, slower, more careful, and the smallest one leaned closer, watching them both, learning without being told. The fire crackled softly, the only sound besides the stream, and in that quiet rhythm, something began to take shape, not in the land, not yet, but in the space between them, something built not from words or promises, but from small, deliberate actions repeated until they meant something more. Elias leaned back slightly, his gaze lifting toward the dark horizon beyond the firelight, and though his face remained still, there was something in his eyes that had not been there before, not relief, not peace, something closer to purpose finding its place again. Far in the distance, beyond the reach of light and warmth, the land stretched silent and vast, carrying stories that had not yet been told, and somewhere out there, the echo of riders still moved, still searching, still following paths that would never quite lead them here. But here, beside that narrow stream, under a sky that held more stars than any of them could count, the beginning had already taken root, quiet, steady, and far stronger than it looked. And as the night deepened and the fire burned lower, the marks on those small pieces of wood remained, simple, imperfect, but undeniable. The first signs of something that would not be forgotten. The first light of morning did not ask permission. It simply arrived, spilling across the stream in quiet streaks of pale gold, touching the edges of stone, the surface of water, the faces of those who had not yet learned to call this place home. And for a moment, everything stood still, as if waiting to see what they would do next. Elias Carter was already on his feet, moving along the edge of the stream with slow, deliberate steps, his boots pressing into the damp soil where water had softened the ground, leaving marks that would not disappear as quickly as those in the dust. And he paused near a slight bend, where the current curved just enough to gather debris, fallen twigs, leaves carried from somewhere upstream, pieces of a world they had not seen but were now connected to. He crouched, picking up a branch no longer than a forearm, turning it once before planting it firmly into the earth near the water's edge, not deep, not forced, just enough to stand. And then he stepped back, studying it like a man measuring something only he could see. Behind him, the children stirred, waking slower than the day itself, the smallest boy rubbing his eyes as he stepped closer to the fire's remains, now only faint warmth beneath gray ash, while the older boy rose with a quiet alertness, already scanning the horizon as if sleep had been nothing more than a pause. Ayanna stepped out last, her gaze moving first to Elias, then to the branch standing alone by the stream, and she walked toward it without speaking, her steps steady, her expression thoughtful. "That is not for marking steps," she said after a moment, her voice calm but certain, and Elias nodded once, not turning. "No," he said, "that is for marking where something begins." The words settled deeper than before, not about movement, not about leaving traces behind, but about placing something into the land that did not intend to leave. Ayanna stepped closer to the branch, reaching out to touch it lightly, her fingers brushing the rough bark. Then she stepped back, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked around, measuring distances, the curve of the stream, the direction of the wind, the way the land dipped and rose beyond their small circle. "If this is where it begins," she said slowly, "then it cannot stay small," Elias allowed. A faint shift in his posture, something that might have been agreement. "It will not," he replied. The older boy approached then, glancing between them, uncertainty still present but less sharp than before. "What do we build?" he asked, and for the first time, Elias turned fully to face them, his eyes moving from one to the other, pausing briefly on the carved pieces of wood still held in their hands. "We build something that does not push people away," he said, his voice low but clear. "Something that does not ask where they came from before it lets them stay." The smallest boy looked up at that, his brow tightening slightly as he tried to understand, and Ayanna spoke before Elias could say more, her voice quieter now, but carrying something stronger than doubt. "A place where no one stands outside the door." Elias met her gaze again, and this time, the silence between them felt different, not empty, not uncertain, but shared. The wind moved gently across the water, creating small ripples that caught the light, breaking it into fragments that danced along the surface. And Elias stepped forward again, reaching into his bag, pulling out another piece of wood, larger this time, more solid, and he handed it to the older boy without hesitation. "Start here," he said, nodding toward the ground near the first branch. The boy hesitated only a moment before kneeling, pressing the wood into the soil with both hands, his movements unsure at first, then firmer as it held. Ayanna watched, then moved to the other side of the branch, placing her own piece down, not identical, not symmetrical, but balanced in a way that did not need to match to feel right. The smallest boy followed last, choosing a spot closer to the water, pressing his piece in with careful effort, his small hands working until it stood. Elias stepped back, watching them, not correcting, not adjusting, just allowing the shape to form as it would, and as he did, the land around them seemed to shift slightly, not in movement, but in meaning, as if the ground itself had accepted what was being placed upon it. The sun rose higher, warming the air, drawing the scent of water and earth upward, and the shadows shortened, pulling closer to their feet, grounding them in a place that had not belonged to them yesterday. Far off in the distance, the horizon remained unchanged, wide and open, carrying the same silence it always had. But here, beside that narrow stream, something had begun to take hold, something that would not be carried away by wind or erased by time. Elias Carter looked at what they had placed, at the simple markers standing in uneven lines, and though they were small, though they could be overlooked by anyone passing too quickly, they carried something weightier than their size suggested, the first proof that this place was no longer empty. And as the morning settled fully around them, the understanding grew quiet but certain that what had started with 3 children and a man who chose not to walk away was no longer just a moment. It was a beginning that would not stay hidden for long. By midday, the shape of the place had begun to change in ways that could not be measured, in feet or miles, but in something quieter, something rooted in the way the children moved without waiting to be told where to stand. Elias Carter watched from a short distance as the older boy adjusted one of the wooden markers, pressing it deeper into the soil so it would not lean when the wind came. And beside him, the smallest boy carried small stones from the edge of the stream, placing them carefully around the base as if building something that needed to be protected, even if he did not yet know why. Ayana moved differently from both of them, not slower, not faster, but with intention, her steps tracing the edges of the space they had begun to claim, her eyes measuring the distance between each marker, the flow of water, the direction of light, as if she could already see what the land might become long before it did. The sun stood high above, pressing warmth into the ground, and with it came the quiet sound of life returning to the space. Insects moving through the grass, the soft ripple of water against stone, and the faint echo of wind brushing across the open plain beyond. Elias stepped forward then, crouching near the stream, dipping his hand into the cool water before letting it fall back in thin streams, watching the way it moved, the way it refused to stay still. And after a moment, he reached for a longer branch, heavier than the others, and carried it toward the center of where the children had placed their markers. He drove it into the ground with steady pressure, not force, letting the soil accept it rather than break under it. And when it stood, taller than the rest, he stepped back, his gaze moving slowly across the growing pattern. "This one stays," he said quietly, not as a command, but as something that did not need to be questioned. The children looked at it, then at each other, and something shifted again, something small but certain, the understanding that this place was no longer temporary, no longer just a stop along a path that led somewhere else. Ayana stepped closer to the taller marker, her hand resting briefly against it, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood, and she nodded once, more to herself than to anyone else. "Then, others will find it," she said, her voice steady, and Elias did not deny it. "If they are looking," he replied. The older boy straightened, wiping his hands against his worn shirt, his eyes scanning the horizon again. But this time there was something different in the way he looked, not just searching for danger, but watching for something else, something that might come toward them instead of after them. The smallest boy knelt near the water, dipping his fingers in again, then looking back at the markers, then at Elias, his expression uncertain but curious. "Will more come?" he asked quietly, and Elias considered the question, not dismissing it, not answering too quickly. "Yes," he said finally. "Some will come because they have nowhere else to go, and some will come because they hear something about this place that does not sound like the rest of the world." The words settled into the air, carried lightly by the wind, and Ayana turned her gaze outward again, toward the far stretch of land where sky met earth, her posture straightening slightly, as if preparing for something that had not yet arrived. The afternoon passed without rush, each moment building on the last, the markers, growing in number, in shape, in meaning, until the space between them began to feel less like open ground and more like something defined, something chosen. Elias worked beside them now, not leading, not directing, just adding his own quiet effort to theirs, placing a stone here, adjusting a branch there, letting the structure take form through shared motion rather than instruction. The sun began to lower once more, stretching shadows long across the ground, and with it came a shift in the air, a subtle change that Elias felt before he saw, before he heard, the kind of awareness that comes from years of listening to things that do not speak. He stood slowly, his gaze turning toward the west, where the light had begun to thin, and there, far off, just at the edge of what could be seen, a movement, faint but deliberate, not the restless drift of wind, not the scattered motion of animals, but something more ordered, more purposeful. Ayana noticed it next, her eyes narrowing slightly, her body stilling in a way that spoke of recognition rather than fear, and the older boy followed her gaze, his breath catching just enough to be heard. The smallest boy remained by the stream, unaware for a moment longer, until the silence around him shifted, until the others stopped moving, and then he turned too, his eyes searching until they found what the others had already seen. The distance was too great to make out details, but the shape was there, a line moving slowly across the horizon, not hidden, not rushing, but coming. Elias did not reach for anything, did not move to hide what they had built. He simply stood, his posture steady, his gaze fixed, and after a moment, he spoke, his voice low but clear. "Then we will see who they are when they arrive." The wind passed through the markers, brushing against the wood, the stones, the small space that had begun to hold more than just ground. And the children stood beside him, not stepping back, not stepping away, their presence no longer uncertain, no longer waiting to be told where they belonged, because for the first time, they were standing in a place that was beginning to belong to them. They did not arrive with noise, and that was what made them impossible to ignore, because men who meant to take something often came loud. But those who came with purpose moved like the land itself, steady, patient, certain they would be seen when the time was right. The line on the horizon grew clearer as the light softened, figures taking shape one by one, not scattered, not uncertain, but aligned in a way that spoke of distance traveled together rather than chance. Elias Carter stood without shifting his stance, his hands resting loose at his sides, his eyes fixed not on the whole group, but on the one at the front, because that was where decisions were carried before they were spoken. Beside him, Ayanna did not step back, did not step forward. She simply adjusted her footing slightly, aligning herself with him without needing to be told, while the older boy swallowed once, steadying his breath, and the smallest boy moved closer, not hiding, just choosing where he stood. The wind passed between them and the approaching riders, carrying the faint sound of hooves against dry earth, slow, measured, and as the distance closed, details began to form, not weapons, not threats, but faces, worn by travel, marked by something heavier than exhaustion, something closer to need. There were 5 of them, maybe 6, men and 1 woman, their clothes dusted with miles of road, their posture careful, not weak, not strong, just aware. And when they reached a point where voices could carry without strain, they stopped, not crossing the space Elias had marked, not stepping into it without being invited. Silence settled then, not empty, not tense, just waiting, the kind that holds meaning before words are given shape. The man at the front removed his hat slowly, revealing a face lined by sun and years, his eyes moving over the markers, the stream, the children, and finally resting on Elias, measuring not who he was, but what he had chosen to stand for. "We heard there was a place," the man said, his voice low, steady, carrying no demand, only a statement shaped by distance. "A place where a man is not turned away before he speaks." The words moved through the air like something that had been said before, somewhere else, carried here by memory more than sound, and Elias did not answer right away, because the truth of a place is not proven by words. It is proven by what stands when words are finished. Instead, he stepped aside, just 1 step, enough to open the space behind him without making it an invitation that needed to be accepted, just enough to show that the line they had reached was not a wall. Ayanna watched that movement closely, her eyes shifting to the newcomers, then back to the markers, then to the taller branch at the center, and she understood what he had done before anyone else did. The older boy noticed next, his shoulders easing slightly, not from relief, but from recognition, and the smallest boy looked up at Elias, then at the strangers, and stayed where he was, because staying was now a choice, not something forced. The man at the front did not move immediately. He glanced back once at the others, a brief exchange passing between them without words. Then he stepped forward, slow, deliberate, crossing the space not as someone claiming it, but as someone willing to be shaped by it. The others followed, one by one, their steps careful, respectful, as if they understood that what they were entering was not just land, but something being built in real time. Ayanna shifted then, moving toward the center marker, her hand resting briefly against it as the first of the newcomers reached the edge of the stream. And for a moment, their eyes met, not in challenge, not in fear, but in something quieter, something like recognition between people who had both walked too far without being welcomed. The woman among them knelt near the water, her hand dipping into the stream, her shoulders lowering slightly as if the simple act of touching it carried more weight than it should have. And when she looked up again, her gaze moved across the markers, the children, and finally to Elias, her expression unreadable, but no longer guarded. Elias remained where he stood, not stepping forward, not stepping back, allowing the space to hold itself, allowing the moment to settle without being pushed. The man who had spoken earlier looked around once more, taking in the uneven lines of wood and stone, The way they marked something that was not yet finished but already real, and he nodded slowly, more to himself than to anyone else. "Then this is the place," he said. Elias met his gaze, his expression unchanged, his voice steady. "It is becoming one," he replied. The wind moved again, brushing through the markers, across the stream, through the space now shared by more than just those who had started it. And in that movement, something shifted, not loudly, not suddenly, but enough to be felt by everyone standing there. Ayanna stepped back slightly, making room without stepping away, and the older boy did the same, while the smallest one remained near the water, watching the reflections shift as more figures entered the frame. No one gave orders, no one claimed anything, but the space expanded, not in size, but in meaning, as if the land itself had decided to accept what was being placed upon it. Elias Carter looked across the faces now gathered, strangers only. Hours ago, and understood something without needing to say it, that what had begun with 3 children had already outgrown the moment that created it, and whatever came next would not belong to him alone. It would belong to all of them, shaped by the choices they made from this point forward. Choices that would carry far beyond the reach of this small stream, and the quiet markers standing beside it. The space did not feel crowded when more people stepped into it. It felt steadier, like a structure that had been waiting for weight to prove it could hold. The newcomers did not speak much at first, not because they had nothing to say, but because they were listening, measuring the quiet rules of a place that had not been written down yet. And Elias Carter let that silence remain, because a place like this did not need to be explained, it needed to be understood. The man who had led them walked slowly along the line of markers, his boots pressing into the ground with care, his gaze following each piece of wood, each stone, until he reached the taller branch at the center, and he stopped there, not touching it, just standing close enough to feel what it meant. "You built this without asking who would come," he said, not turning, his voice carrying a quiet respect that had not been there before. Elias remained where he was, his posture unchanged. "I built it so they could," he replied, and the words settled into the space like something that had always been there, waiting to be said. The woman who had knelt by the stream rose slowly, water still clinging to her fingers, and she stepped closer to Ayanna, her eyes studying the girl with a kind of recognition that did not come from knowing her name, but from knowing her place in the world, the kind of place that was often denied before it was understood. "You chose to stay," the woman said softly, and Ayanna met her gaze without hesitation. "I chose to build," she answered, and the difference between the two words shifted something in the air, something that could not be taken back. The older boy moved then, stepping toward the man at the center, his hands no longer uncertain, his shoulders no longer pulled inward, and he picked up another piece of wood, pressing it into the ground beside the others without waiting for instruction, without asking if he should, because that question no longer belonged here. The smallest boy followed, carrying another stone, placing it carefully where it fit, his movement slower but no less certain, and when he stepped back, he did not look to Elias for approval. He looked at what he had done, as if measuring it for himself. The newcomers watched this, not interrupting, not questioning, and one of them, a younger man with dust still fresh on his coat, stepped forward hesitantly, holding a small piece of wood he had carried with him, and he paused at the edge of the markers. Glancing once at Elias, not asking permission, but acknowledging the space he was about to enter. Elias gave no sign, no nod, no gesture, and that was the answer. The man stepped in, placing his piece down among the others, not perfectly aligned, not matching the pattern, but belonging all the same. The wind moved through them again, stronger now, brushing against the markers, the stream, the figures standing in a place that had not existed the day before, and for a moment, the sound of it filled the silence completely, carrying something with it that felt like the beginning of a story being told without words. Ayanna stepped back toward Elias then, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "They will keep coming," she said, and Elias did not look at her, his gaze still on the growing space before them. "Then we will keep building," he replied. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched across the markers, weaving them together in lines of light and dark, and, as the shadows lengthened, the space began to feel less like a beginning and more like something that had already taken root, something that would not be undone by distance or doubt. The man at the center turned back toward Elias, his expression different now, not measured, not uncertain, but settled. "What do we call it?" he asked, and the question did not come from curiosity. It came from understanding that a place without a name is often easier to erase. Elias remained still for a moment, letting the question pass through him, not rushing to answer, because names had weight, and this place had not yet decided what it needed to carry. Ayanna looked at the markers, at the stream, at the people who had stepped into something that did not exist for them before this moment, and she spoke before Elias could, her voice quiet but clear. "We do not name it yet," she said, and the others turned toward her, listening. "We let it grow first," she continued. "We let it become something that cannot be mistaken, something that does not need to be explained." The man at the center considered this, his gaze moving across the space once more, and then he nodded slowly, as if recognizing that some things gain strength before they are given words. Elias glanced at Ayanna then, just once, a brief look that carried more than approval, something closer to trust, and then he looked back at the others, at the pieces they had placed, at the land that now held more than just ground beneath their feet. Night began to settle again, the sky deepening, the first stars appearing above them, and with it came a quiet that no longer felt uncertain, no longer felt temporary, but steady, like something that had decided to stay. And in that quiet, with more hands now shaping what had begun with so little, the understanding grew stronger, that this place was no longer just a refuge. It was becoming something else entirely, something that would not ask where you came from. Only what you chose to build when you arrived. Morning came again. But this time it did not arrive quietly. It carried movement, more than before, more than the land had seen in a long while. And with it came something else, something that could not be measured in steps or distance, something that lived in the way people now approached the stream without hesitation, without asking if they were allowed. Elias Carter stood at the edge of the growing space, his gaze moving across what had once been empty ground and was now marked by dozens of uneven lines, wood and stone placed by different hands, each one carrying a story that had not needed to be told aloud. The markers had multiplied overnight, not perfectly aligned, not planned, but real, and between them, paths had begun to form, faint at first, then clearer with every step taken across them. Ayanna walked those paths slowly, her eyes tracing the way they connected, how one led to another, how no single line stood alone anymore. And as she moved, others followed, not because she led them, but because they had begun to see what she saw. The older boy worked near the stream, stacking stones in a low, careful wall, not to block the water, but to guide it, to shape its movement so it could serve more than just one place. And the smallest boy stayed close, handing him pieces one by one, his movements more confident now, his hesitation fading with each small task completed. The newcomers had settled into the rhythm without needing to be taught, each one finding a place, a role, something that allowed them to give instead of just take, and the space responded, growing not in size, but in meaning, in the way it held them together without forcing them to be the same. Elias watched this without stepping in, his hands resting at his sides, his posture calm. But there was something in his stillness now that had not been there before, not distance, not detachment, but a quiet awareness that what he had started was no longer his to guide alone. The man who had arrived first stood nearby, his hat now resting in his hands, his gaze fixed on the markers as if trying to understand how something so simple could hold so much weight. "It is spreading," he said softly, not as a concern, but as an observation, and Elias nodded once. "That is what happens when something is not held back," he replied. The woman moved toward Ayanna again, her steps steady, her expression thoughtful, and she spoke in a voice that carried only to those near her. "You knew this would happen," she said, and Ayanna shook her head slightly. "No," she answered, "but I knew it could." The wind passed through them, stronger now, lifting loose dust into the air, brushing against the markers, the stones, the hands that continued to shape them. And in that movement, something became clear, not through words, but through presence, that this place was no longer hidden, no longer just a quiet beginning. It had become visible in a way that could not be undone. Elias turned his gaze outward then, beyond the stream, beyond the markers, to the far stretch of land where the horizon met the sky. And there, again, movement. Not one line this time, but several, scattered, distant, but coming. Not with urgency, not with fear, but with purpose. Ayana followed his gaze, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in alarm, but in recognition, and she spoke quietly. They heard, and Elias did not deny it, because this was no longer something that could be contained. The older boy looked up from his work, his breath catching slightly as he saw what they saw. And for a moment, the old uncertainty flickered in him again, the memory of being turned away, of not belonging. But it did not hold. It passed, replaced by something steadier, something built from the ground beneath his feet. Then they will come here, he said, and Elias turned to him, his expression unchanged. Yes, he replied. And when they do, they will not be asked why. The words settled into the space, carried by the wind, absorbed by the land, and the people within it, and Ayana stepped forward, moving toward the center marker, her hand resting against it once more, grounding herself in something that no longer felt temporary. The man beside Elias exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering, as if something he had carried for a long time had finally found a place to rest, and he looked at Elias again, not as a stranger, not as a question, but as something else entirely. You did not build this for yourself, he said, and Elias met his gaze, steady. No, he answered. I built it so it would not need me. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, filled with the sound of movement, of hands working, of water flowing, of a place becoming something that could stand without being held. The sun rose higher, casting light across the growing space, illuminating every marker, every path, every person who had chosen to stay, and as that light settled, the understanding became undeniable, that what had begun as a small act of refusal, a choice not to turn away, had become something far greater than any one man could claim, something that would continue to grow, to change, to welcome, long after the moment that created it had passed. And in that realization, the land itself seemed to hold its breath, as if preparing for what would come next. By the time the next line of travelers reached the edge of the land, the place no longer looked like something that had just begun. It looked like something that had always been waiting. The markers standing taller now, the paths worn deeper, the stream guided by careful hands into channels that carried water where it was needed, not where it happened to fall. The people who arrived did not hesitate as much as the first ones had. They slowed. Yes, they watched, yes, but the hesitation did not hold them, because what stood before them did not feel like a question anymore. It felt like an answer. Elias Carter stood a little further back than before, not at the center, not at the edge, but somewhere in between, where he could see everything without needing to be seen first. His presence no longer the beginning of the place, but a part of it, quiet, steady, no longer separate from what had grown around him. Ayana stood near the central marker, her posture straight, her gaze calm, and when the newcomers approached, she did not move aside, she did not step forward, she simply remained, and that was enough, because the place did not require anyone to welcome others with words. It welcomed them by existing. The older boy had grown into his movements, his hands sure as he worked along the stone line near the water, guiding it with a precision that had once belonged only to Elias, and the smallest boy moved beside him without fear. Now, no longer asking where to stand, only deciding where he could help. The man who had first arrived days before now stood among the others, not as a visitor, not as a stranger, but as someone who had chosen to stay, his hat resting low again, his eyes no longer measuring, but recognizing. And when one of the new travelers looked toward him with uncertainty, he simply nodded, a small gesture, but enough to carry meaning. The wind moved across the land again, but it did not feel empty now. It moved through people, through structure, through something that held it, shaping it. And as it passed, it carried voices, not loud, not overwhelming, but present, the quiet exchange of people who had found a place where they did not need to explain themselves before they could belong. Elias turned his gaze once more to the horizon, not searching for riders this time, not measuring distance, but simply looking. And what he saw was no longer something approaching. It was something unfolding. Lines of movement that did not threaten, did not chase, but but connected, each one leading toward the same place, not because they had been told to come, but because something about it had reached them long before they ever saw it. Iana stepped closer to him then, her voice low, carrying only to where he stood. "It will not stay hidden," she said, and Elias let the words settle before answering. "It was never meant to," he replied. She looked out across the land again, then back at the people moving through the space, her expression calm, but there was something deeper beneath it, something that understood the weight of what had been created, not as a place, but as a choice that would now repeat itself in others. "They will try to name it," she said quietly, and Elias allowed a faint shift in his expression, not quite a smile, not quite anything that could be held. "Then they will try to own it," he answered, his voice steady, and after a moment, he added, "But they will not understand it." The silence that followed was not heavy. It was clear, like the sky above them. And the man who had first spoken when he arrived stepped closer, his voice carrying just enough to reach Elias and Iana both. "Then what is it?" he asked, not demanding, not pressing, but seeking something that could be held onto. Elias looked at the markers, at the stream, at the people who now moved without waiting. And then he looked at Iana, not for permission, not for agreement, but for something shared, and she met his gaze without hesitation. "It is not a place," Elias said finally, his voice low but certain. "It is a choice." The words did not echo, they did not need to, they settled into the ground, into the air, into the people who heard them. And something shifted again, not in structure, not in size, but in understanding. The smallest boy looked up from his work, his hands still holding a stone, and though he did not fully grasp the words, he felt them, and he placed the stone more carefully than before, as if it mattered more now. The older boy straightened, his gaze moving across the land, no longer searching for what might come, but seeing what already was, and the man beside him nodded once, as if confirming something he had not known he was looking for. Iana stepped back then, her hand brushing once more against the central marker, and as she did, the carved piece of wood she had carried from the beginning caught the light, its lines worn, its meaning deepened by time and touch, and she held it not as something given, but as something chosen. Elias Carter remained where he was, not stepping forward, not stepping away, because there was nowhere left to go that was not already part of what had been built. And as the sun climbed higher, casting light across a place that had grown beyond its beginning, the understanding became quiet and complete, that out here, where the land had once held nothing but distance, something had been placed that could not be taken, not by force, not by name, not by time, because it did not belong to the ground alone. It belonged to every hand that chose to build instead of turn away. And that was something no one could ever truly take from them. Thanks for watching this story. Subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Tell me in the comments what you felt about this story and what kind of stories you want to see next. See you in the next story.